we will cover the information on our next energy yielding nutrient, which is fat. Fat actually belongs to a family of compounds that includes triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. And this family is known as the lipids. So often you will hear the term fat and lipid used interchangeably, and rightly so. We know in recent years that many studies have linked the consumption of excess fat to an increased risk of certain diseases. But what we want to keep in mind is that we need a certain amount of fat. We have fat that are involved in various body processes. Often it can be a challenge trying to determine which fats are the healthier ones to try to incorporate into our diet as opposed to those we need to limit. Hopefully through this chapter you'll get a much better idea as far as how to make the best possible choices when it does come to fat. We'll take a look at each one of these types of fat that fall under this family of lipids. However, the first thing we're going to note are some of the general characteristics that cover all three of these types of fats. First of all, they are essential nutrients, meaning that your body cannot make them or cannot make them in sufficient amounts. For that reason, we have to get them from the food that we eat. Second characteristic is that these fats are found in both plants and animals. Often we think of fat being found in things like maybe a fatty cut of meat, butter, dairy products, but also consider that fat is found in plants. Think about vegetable oils, soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil. Those are all plant products, yet they do contain fat. Fats are also insoluble in water, which means that if you tried to mix them together with water, they won't mix. The fat will simply float on top. Fat is referred to as being hydrophobic. Also, the chemical makeup of fats include one or more fatty acid in its structure. And we'll take a look in just a minute at what a fatty acid actually looks like. Then lastly, it doesn't matter whether it's a triglyceride, a phospholipid, or a sterol. They all contain the same amount of calories, 9 calories per gram. Now this is more than carbohydrate or protein provide. If you recall, they provide 4 calories per gram. And the reason is that fat contains many more carbons and hydrogens in proportion to their oxygens. For that reason, when they go through the metabolic pathway, they can simply generate more energy. Let's start our review of the fats with the triglycerides. Triglycerides are the type of fat that are found most often stored in our body as well as in the foods we are consuming. 99% of the fat that we store is in the form of triglyceride, and 95% of the fat that we consume from food is in the form of triglyceride. Basic structure of a triglyceride is that it is a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids being attached. This occurs through a condensation reaction. The glycerol backbone is simply an alcohol composed of a 3-carbon chain. This attaches to those 3 fatty acids, which those fatty acids are organic compounds composed of a carbon chain that have hydrogens attached. But then there's 2 other groups attached as well. There is an acid group as well as a methyl group. This slide helps you to visualize how a molecule of triglyceride is created. You can see the combination of the glycerol backbone with the 3 fatty acids. They combine through that condensation reaction, not only producing a molecule of triglyceride, but then as well 3 molecules of water. All fatty acids have the same basic structure, carbon and hydrogen atoms, plus an acid group and a methyl group. They may differ, however, in the length of the carbon chains. Fatty acids with less than 6 carbons are referred to as short-chain fatty acids. Those which contain 6 to 12 carbons are referred to as medium-chain fatty acids, and those with greater than 12 carbons are referred to as long-chain fatty acids. Most naturally occurring fatty acids have anywhere between 4 to 24 carbons in their length, always, however, with an even number of carbons. 18-carbon fatty acids are the most common that we find in foods. Another classification when we're talking about fatty acids are they saturated or are they unsaturated? Saturated fats have no double bonding between any of their carbons. Very simply, they're filled to capacity with hydrogen atoms. Unsaturated fat, however, has carbons that are joined together by double bonds because of a lack of hydrogens. Because of this type of a structure, more hydrogens can be added to the carbon chain. Then, under this category of unsaturated fatty acids, we have two subcategories. The first are the monounsaturated fatty acids. These are the type that have one double bond, and often you will hear these referred to as the MUFAs. Then we have the polyunsaturated fatty acids, which have more than one double bond, and often these are referred to as the PUFAs. Let's take a look at these three different types of fatty acids, saturated versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated. If we look at the top example, stearic acid, this is an 18-carbon saturated fatty acid. This commonly occurs in animal products such as meat and milk. If you look down the chain of carbons, you can see that there are no double bonds present. The middle example is oleic acid, which is a type of fatty acid predominantly found in plants. Rich sources include especially olive oil or canola oil. Again, there are 18 carbons in the chain, but if you look down that entire chain, you will see that there is one double bond present. Because of that one double bond, it's referred to as a monounsaturated fatty acid. The third example is linoleic acid, which is the fatty acid which is found predominantly in many vegetable oils. Looking down its chain of carbons, you'll see that there are two double bonds. Therefore, this is going to be categorized as a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Fatty acids not only differ in the length of their chains and the degree of saturation, but also in the location of their double bonds. Polyunsaturated fats are identified by the position of the double bond, which is closest to the methyl end of its carbon chain. This is referred to as the omega number. Now, you may be familiar with omega-3s, which many health organizations encourage us to consume on a regular basis for health reasons. And we'll review the benefits of omega-3s as we go further in the lecture. But what is an omega-3? Well, if you look at the first structure noted on this slide, it's an example of an omega-3. Simply look down the carbon chain, and what you'll see is that the first double bond, counting from the methyl end, appears at the third carbon, designating it an omega-3. The second example you could see there is an omega-6. Again, counting from the methyl end of the carbon chain, you could see that the first double bond appears at the sixth carbon. In nature, we have omega-3s, we have omega-6s, as well as omega-9s appearing. The degree of saturation or unsaturation influences the physical characteristics of a fat. Fats that tend to contain more saturated fatty acids are going to be solid at room temperature, where fats that contain more unsaturated fatty acids are more likely to be liquid at room temperature. If we look at the comparison of both of these types, you're going to see a difference in the makeup of the triglyceride molecule. On the left here, you could see your triglyceride, which has 3 completely saturated fatty acids attached to it. Because they are all saturated fatty acids, they tend to stack very neatly on top of each other. That in turn leads them to be more solid or more firm at room temperature. Our example on the right is of a triglyceride molecule that has 1 saturated fatty acid combined with 2 unsaturated fatty acids. What you notice here is that the 2 unsaturated fatty acids, they tend to bend at the point of their double bond. Because of that, the molecule doesn't stack quite as neatly together, and that in turn changes the physical characteristic. With an unsaturated type of fatty acid makeup, you're going to have a fat which tends to be more liquid at room temperature. Examples of saturated fats, well, they include things like butter, animal fat, coconut, as well as palm oils or palm kernel oils. Monounsaturated fats include things like olive, peanut, and canola oils. Polyunsaturated fats include vegetable oils such as corn, sunflower, and safflower oils. Something to keep in mind, however, is that the majority of the fats that we find in food include a mixture of the different types of fatty acids. If you look at examples of those we consider to be saturated fats, coconut oil, butter, beef tallow, and so forth, you'll also notice that they contain some unsaturated fat. Because they have a higher proportion, though, of saturated fatty acids, that's why they're going to be solid at room temperature. The unsaturated fats, same thing applies. If you look closely at their makeup, what you're going to see is that they contain not only unsaturated fatty acids, but also saturated fatty acids. However, again, because the greater proportion is going to be unsaturated fatty acids, that's why they're going to be liquid at room temperature. The degree of saturation or unsaturation also influences the stability of a fat. All fats can spoil when they're exposed to oxygen. Exposure to oxygen can cause a fat to develop an off flavor or even an off smell to it, which we refer to as going rancid. Exposure to heat, exposure to light can also speed up this process. Polyunsaturated fats have been found to spoil most readily because their double bonds are unstable. Monounsaturated fats are slightly less susceptible to spoiling. Saturated fats, however, are more resistant to oxidation, and because of this, they are very commonly used by food manufacturers in their products. Instead of simply using stable saturated fat in products, food chemists developed a process known as hydrogenation. This involves adding hydrogen atoms to unsaturated fat. This in turn can protect the unsaturated fat from becoming oxidized. Shelf life improves, as well as there's a change in the overall texture of the fat. It becomes more solid by the hydrogenation process. During this process, too, the configuration of the fat changes to what's known as a trans configuration. Fatty acids in nature are usually in what we refer to as cis configuration, and by adding the hydrogen atoms, in turn, turns it to this trans configuration, creating what we refer to as trans fatty acids. The major issue is that through years of studies, what's been identified is that consuming trans fatty acids can increase your risk for heart disease. They can alter your cholesterol levels as well as other blood lipids. On the nutrition facts portion of the food label, trans fat is listed. However, you also want to check the ingredient list. If it says hydrogenated oil or partially hydrogenated oil, That's telling you that there are trans fats present in that particular food. As of June 2018, as per the FDA, food manufacturers in the United States cannot add trans fats to their foods. However, any food that is currently on the market does have the potential of having trans fat still in it. So you want to be checking the labels for those processed foods that you're getting off the shelves of the grocery store. The goal of the World Health Organization is to eliminate trans fat worldwide by 2023. There are still other countries who are incorporating trans fat into the regular foods that are being consumed. With the process of hydrogenation, you could see how the fatty acid changes its configuration. On the left side of this slide, you can see a cis fatty acid. This is the configuration that usually appears in nature. This is where the hydrogens tend to be on the same side of the double bond. When hydrogens are added, what occurs then is a change to this trans configuration. This is considered to be a more linear type of a molecule, where now the hydrogens are on the opposite sides of the double bond. Main issue is our body is not quite sure how to metabolize this, and in turn it increases the health risks such as heart disease, elevation in blood cholesterol, as well as other blood lipids. The second category of fat that we will take a look at are the phospholipids. And the phospholipids have a few things in common with triglycerides. First of all, they contain a glycerol backbone. And they also contain fatty acids. They contain two. In place of the third fatty acid, however, that a triglyceride molecule would have, you're going to find a phosphate group with a molecule of choline. This very unique makeup of a phospholipid is what leads it to function as an emulsifier. An emulsifier is very simply a substance with both water-soluble and fat-soluble portions that help to promote the mixing together of oils and fats in watery solutions. The fatty acid component allows for solubility in fat, whereas the phosphate group allows for solubility in water. Think about what happens if you try to mix together oil and water. The oil simply floats on top of the watery surface. It doesn't come together, it doesn't mix. For that to mix together and stay together, what's required is an emulsifier. Something like phospholipid, or more specifically lecithin, is often used in the food industry to bring together those substances that usually don't mix. If you think about things like salad dressings, mayonnaise, the way that the fat stays immersed in the watery component is due to the presence of an emulsifier. In a large amount of the cases, this emulsifier is lecithin. There are some natural food sources of lecithin. They include eggs, liver, soybeans, wheat germ, as well as peanuts. To help us visualize a lecithin molecule, you can see the glycerol backbone on the left-hand side of the slide, the top portion, the two fatty acids, and then in place of another fatty acid on the bottom, you could see that there is a molecule of phosphate as well as a molecule of choline. Lecithin, as well as other phospholipids, make up parts of our cell membranes. Because phospholipids are soluble in both water and fat, they are very helpful in allowing fat-soluble substances, things like vitamins A, D, E, and K, hormones, to pass easily in and out of cells. They can also work as an emulsifier because they can help keep fats suspended in blood and body fluids. Now, lecithin is made in our body. You find it in food, but it's also made in our body, specifically by our liver. And besides just being an emulsifier, it has another important function. It is a precursor for a specific neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine. In addition to triglyceride and phospholipid, the third category of fats include the sterols. The sterols are lipid compounds that have a multiple ring type structure with side chains attached. So you could see its makeup is much different compared to a triglyceride or a phospholipid. Sterols are made both by the body as well as found in various foods. And the one which is probably the most well known is cholesterol. Many important body compounds are derived from sterols. These include bile acids, the sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen, adrenal hormones such as cortisol or aldosterone, as well as vitamin D. In fact, vitamin D, for it to be synthesized within the body, comes from cholesterol. In fact, if you look at the comparison of the chemical makeup of cholesterol versus vitamin D, you'll see that they are almost identical. The only difference is that cholesterol has a closed ring, and you can see that that's highlighted in red in the molecule itself, whereas vitamin D's is open in that same place. That's what allows it to account for its vitamin activity. Our liver also makes sterols, specifically cholesterol, in a very large amount. Our liver can make anywhere from about 800 to 1500 milligrams of cholesterol per day. This is known as endogenous cholesterol. This endogenous cholesterol actually contributes more to the body's total than comes from diet. Your liver is very efficient at taking small fragments of carbohydrate, fat, and protein to be able to produce cholesterol. Sterols are found in both plant and animal foods. Now, the plant sterols have been identified as having some health benefits. What they can do is interfere with cholesterol absorption. What's been suggested then is a diet rich in plant sterols can help to lower blood cholesterol levels, therefore decreasing the risk of heart disease. Because of this association, food manufacturers have now fortified foods such as margarine, spreads, even some yogurts with plant sterols. By adding the plant sterols to these particular types of foods, they've created what we now refer to as a functional food. Now, cholesterol as a sterol is found only in animal foods. You'll find it in meat, eggs, fish, poultry, as well as dairy products. And this is referred to as exogenous cholesterol compared to the endogenous, which is the type that our liver makes. Cholesterol is not found in any type of a plant product. You won't find cholesterol in vegetable oils. You won't find cholesterol in any other type of a food unless it is an animal food. Now that we've looked at the three categories of fat, triglyceride, phospholipids, and sterols, let's follow them now as they go through our GI tract. On any given day, the average fat intake is estimated to be about 50 to 100 grams of triglycerides consumed, about 4 to 8 grams of phospholipids, as well as 200 to 350 milligrams of cholesterol. One of the issues with fat digestion is that fat in general tend to be hydrophobic. Fat doesn't like to mix with water, so it will separate from the watery fluids involved in digestion. The digestive enzymes, on the other hand, which are necessary to break down fat, are hydrophilic, which means they are attracted to water. So how can digestion of fat then occur? This is where bile plays a very important role. Bile functions as an emulsifier, allowing fats to eventually be broken down by the digestive enzymes for absorption. Let's start once again at the beginning of the GI tract. What happens to fat in your mouth, the entry point of our GI tract? Well, not too much. There is an enzyme which is produced by our salivary glands, which is known as lingual lipase. In adults, however, it plays a very insignificant role in fat digestion. However, in infants, this lingual lipase that's produced will actually start to digest short chain as well as medium chain fatty acids. These are the fatty acids that are predominantly found in breast milk as well as infant formula. So as far as a starting point for digestion for infants, it definitely would occur in the mouth. For us as adults, there really isn't anything significant occurring at this point. So once fat in the form of a bolus then is going to slide down your esophagus into the stomach, the muscles will contract, dispersing some of the fat into smaller droplets. There is an enzyme present which is known as gastric lipase. And if these gastric lipase enzymes by some chance come in contact with the fat, they may be able to break down a very small amount. Again, remember that fat is hydrophobic. The watery components of your stomach then are going to have the fat floating on the surface. Those enzymes are going to be hydrophilic. They're going to be down in the watery components of the stomach. So they are not going to have the opportunity to get into contact with too much of the fat globules. It won't be until fat in the form of chyme enters into the small intestine that any major digestion will take place. Once the fat enters the small intestine, the gallbladder will be signaled to release bile. Once that bile is released, fats can be emulsified, therefore allowing the digestive enzymes to start to break them down. If we look at this emulsification process, the first thing that you'll note is fat entering into the stomach. The fat simply is going to float on top of the watery solution. The enzymes, which are hydrophilic, tend to remain in the watery solution, not being able to get to the fat. When the fat enters the small intestine, the gallbladder is going to release bile, allowing it to emulsify the fat. As an emulsifier, bile has an affinity for both the fat as well as the water, so it can bring together the two, allowing the enzymes to start the digestion process. There are specific enzymes which play a very important role in hydrolyzing or digesting fats into smaller units. These smaller units will be the monoglycerides as well as the fatty acids. The enzymes include pancreatic as well as intestinal enzymes. Phospholipids, this type of particular fat, are also hydrolyzed or broken down. Sterols, however, are a little bit different. They are absorbed intact without being first hydrolyzed. Here's an example of the hydrolysis or the digestion of a triglyceride. You can see where the bonds are broken within the molecule itself, resulting in the release of a monoglyceride as well as two specific fatty acids. These smaller units can now enter into the absorptive process. This figure allows you to trace the digestion of fat through the GI tract. with the ultimate goal of breaking down triglycerides into monoglycerides, fatty acids, as well as glycerol. Note the summary of the processes that we just reviewed. Depending on what the breakdown product is after fat digestion determines where they will travel. Glycerol and short and medium chain fatty acids easily cross the intestinal cells, and they can then be absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Monoglycerides and the long chain fatty acids are reformed into new molecules of triglycerides within the intestinal cells. Then these new molecules of triglyceride, along with cholesterol and phospholipids, are assembled into what are known as chylomicrons. These chylomicrons are released into the lymphatic system, and then eventually they go into the bloodstream. These fats can then be used in some cases for immediate energy. In other cases, they may be stored for future use. These chylomicrons are just one example of a lipoprotein or a fat transporter. The chylomicrons are one of 4 lipoproteins that we are going to review. As a group, these lipoproteins or these fat transporters are very important because they help to solve the body's challenge of transporting fat through our water-based bloodstream. Each one of these lipoproteins are distinguishable by their size as well as their density. Each type of lipoprotein contains different amounts and different kinds of lipids and proteins. Very simply, the more lipids, the less dense the molecule will be. The more proteins, the more dense the molecule will be. If you take a look at this particular figure, you can see the relative composition as well as the sizes of the lipoproteins that we will review. From the previous slide, you could see that the chylomicrons are the largest and least dense of the lipoproteins. They transport the diet-derived fats, mostly in the form of triglyceride, from the small intestine into the lymphatic system, finally to the bloodstream, and then to various cells within our body. Cells all over our body have the capability of removing triglycerides from the chylomicrons as they pass by. So what happens is the chylomicrons actually get smaller and smaller. The remnants that remain of protein, cholesterol, and phospholipids are then removed by the liver. The next lipoproteins to note are the very low density lipoproteins, or we refer to them as VLDLs. Our liver is the most active site of fat synthesis. The cells are consistently making cholesterol, fatty acids, as well as other lipid compounds. Eventually, all of those fats get packaged together with protein in the form of a very low density lipoprotein. The main function of these is to transport those lipids from the liver and deliver them to the cells and the tissue. What happens with the VLDLs is that they get smaller and become more dense as the triglyceride portion is taken up by the cells. Eventually, the very low density lipoprotein becomes a low density lipoprotein. The third category of lipoproteins are the LDLs, or the low density lipoproteins. As you can see from their makeup, they are predominantly cholesterol. The main function of the LDLs is that as they circulate, they deposit this cholesterol as well as some triglyceride and phospholipids to various body cells and tissues, including our heart as well as the walls of our arteries. These cells and tissues can then use some of these fats for various processes. There are LDL receptors that are present on the cells of our liver, which play a crucial role in trying to control blood cholesterol concentrations by removing our LDLs from circulation. This is the type of lipoprotein that has been associated with an increased risk of heart disease. The last category of lipoproteins are the HDLs, or the high-density lipoproteins. And from their makeup, you could see that they are predominantly protein. Their main function is the opposite of an LDL. The HDLs have the capability of picking up the fats, picking up most specifically the cholesterol, and taking it back to the liver. The liver can then either recycle or dispose of it. Because it's taking away the fat from the cells, from the tissues, from the walls of the arteries, it is associated with a reduced risk of heart disease. Another property to note of the HDLs is that they have anti-inflammatory capabilities. They have been found to be able to interfere with plaque from breaking apart off the wall of an artery, traveling throughout the bloodstream, causing a blockage, and then eventually initiating a potential heart attack. They are definitely associated with a decreased risk of heart disease. This summary of the path of lipid transport allows you to review the specific functions of the 4 lipoproteins. As noted in our review of the lipoproteins, LDLs are associated with an increased risk of heart disease, and HDLs are associated with a decreased risk of heart disease. Ideally, then, we want our LDL levels to be low and our HDL levels to be high. There are certain factors that have been identified that can help to lower your LDL and raise your HDL. These factors include weight control, replacing your saturated fat with monounsaturated as well as polyunsaturated fat, consuming soluble fibers, including phytochemicals in your diet, specifically flavonoids. Flavonoids have been found to help reduce the oxidation of the LDL cholesterol, decrease overall inflammation, and also reduce the stickiness of our blood platelets, which that in turn can cause clotting. Flavonoids can be found in various foods such as red and purple grapes, certain grains, green and black tea, as well as citrus fruits. Other factors that can help modify our LDL and HDL levels include moderate alcohol consumption. For men, this would include a limit of 2 drinks per day, and for women, a limit of 1 drink per day. Physical activity also has been shown to have an impact in being able to raise HDL levels. And the type of activity that seems to have the greatest impact is aerobic activity. Why do we need fat, whether it is dietary fat or body fat? Well, it has quite a few functions, and most of the functions that we're going to note involve triglycerides. Why triglycerides? If you recall, 99% of all of the fat stored in our body is in the form of triglyceride, and 95% of all of the fat found in food is in the form of triglycerides. So it would make sense why triglycerides are the main type that play a very, very important role. First to note is that fat, again specifically triglycerides, are a source of energy, providing us with 9 calories per gram. The body can store huge amounts of fat in its adipose tissue. Liver and muscle, on the other hand, can only store a certain amount of glycogen. The liver can also convert excess amounts of carbohydrate and protein to fat, then allow them to also be stored. Fat allows us to maintain our body temperature. It helps to cushion and protect our organs as well as our bones. It also plays an integral part in maintaining cell membranes. Another important function of fat is that it provides essential fatty acids. Our body can't make 2 specific fatty acids, and these are linoleic and linolenic acid. These are important because they are precursors to make omega-6 as well as omega-3s. And you can note that there are several specific functions which require these 2 types of omega fats. We noted the importance of having a lower amount of LDL and a higher amount of HDL in our blood to reduce our risk of heart disease. But what are the actual numbers that we want to try to focus on? Well, we need to also consider the other blood lipid levels, the lipids that would be obtained from a lipid profile. Total cholesterol, ideally, we would desire to be less than 200 milligrams per deciliter, LDL less than 100, HDL greater than 60, and triglycerides less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. Focusing on the health effects that correlate with fat intake, we start once again with heart disease. As I had previously noted, elevated LDL cholesterol levels are a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The LDL cholesterol portion accumulates in the arteries, restricts blood flow, and raises blood pressure. Saturated fat in the diet has been found to raise this LDL level. The current American diet delivers excessive amounts of solid fats, which are predominantly saturated. The foods that we're consuming that tend to be highest in saturated fat include whole milk, cream, butter, cheese, high-fat cuts of beef and pork, as well as coconut, palm, and palm kernel oils. A high saturated fat intake is not the only culprit in increasing our risk for heart disease. We also need to consider trans fats. Trans fat in our diet has been shown to increase LDL levels while decreasing HDL levels. However, as of June 2018, which I had previously noted, food manufacturers can no longer include trans fat in their products. So hopefully this will have a positive effect on our overall health risks. However, continue to check labels. Continue to check labels for the words hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, because those are both going to identify the presence of trans fat. Then we need to consider the risk from dietary cholesterol. For years we were told to limit our intake of foods higher in cholesterol. However, recent studies have shown us that dietary cholesterol actually has less of an effect on our blood cholesterol than saturated fat and trans fat. Where do we find cholesterol? Cholesterol, if you recall, only found in animal products. So cholesterol can be found in egg yolks, milk products, meat, poultry, as well as shellfish and fish. The link between dietary fat and cancer is not quite as strong as the link between dietary fat and heart disease. While dietary fat doesn't seem to initiate cancer development, it may promote cancer once it has arisen. What's been found is that saturated fat may have a greater effect on this risk than unsaturated fat. Omega-3s have been shown to potentially have more of a protective effect. We'll go into much more detail in Chapter 18 when we look at the relationship between diet and cancer. Then obesity. Obviously, a high intake of fat can potentially cause excess calorie consumption. What that can do then in turn is cause excessive weight gain. And once again, in Chapter 18, we'll see a very strong relationship between obesity and certain chronic diseases. As I previously noted, one of the recommendations to help reduce the risk of heart disease is to replace saturated fat with monounsaturated as well as polyunsaturated fat. Studies have shown us that the type of fat may be more important than the amount of fat when it comes to reducing disease risk. So what do you want to include? Well, good sources of monounsaturated fats, olive, canola, and peanut oils, nuts, as well as seeds and avocados. Sources of polyunsaturated fat include pretty much every type of vegetable oil, as well as nuts and seeds. In our review of fat structure, the omega fatty acids were discussed. The omega number indicates the position of the first double bond in the carbon chain that appears counting from the methyl end of the fatty acid. Because of this configuration, there have been positive health effects noted, and they include omega-3s having the potential to reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke, help to lower blood pressure and triglyceride levels, reduce blood clots, and protect against irregular heartbeat. Omega-3s have also been associated with being less likely to promote cancer than other fats, possibly due to the fact that omega-3s can help to suppress body inflammation. Good food sources of omega-3s, canola as well as flaxseed oils, walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds themselves, as well as what we refer to as cold water fish. Mackerel, salmon, tuna, sardines, herring all contain larger amounts of the omega-3s. However, if you're taking a supplement of an omega-3, fish oil supplement, you want to be careful not to consume high-dose supplements. What's been found is that in excessive amounts, the fish oil capsules can cause excessive bleeding. Because of this possibility, the FDA has an upper limit noted of 3,000 milligrams per day of a fish oil capsule. Another note is that on these capsules, look that it states that the capsules are purified from mercury. Otherwise, you take the risk of developing a very toxic amount of this heavy metal building up in your body. What's the recommendation for fat consumption? The Dietary Reference Intake and the Dietary Guidelines recommend an intake of fat at 20 to 35% of our total caloric intake. So for someone consuming 2,000 calories a day, that would be equivalent to 400 to 700 calories, or more specifically, 44 to 77 grams of fat. Of that amount, you also want to focus on consuming less than 10% from saturated fat, because of that associated link with saturated fat and the increased risk of chronic diseases. For the daily value recommendation, 65 grams of fat would be the appropriate amount based on 30% of a 2,000 calorie diet. The amount of saturated fat then would correspond with 20 grams based on 10% of that 2,000 calorie diet. In our text on page 157, there is an example of how you can calculate your personal daily value for fat intake. General guidelines to help reduce fat, or more specifically saturated fat, include selecting lean options of meats. Back in earlier chapters, we noted the cuts of meat such as round or loin being healthier choices. Also, meats that are labeled as select or choice are going to be better selections than those that are labeled as being prime. Incorporating meat alternatives, things like legumes, soy products, edamame, are ways that you can include plant-based proteins while decreasing overall saturated fat, including fish at least 2 times a week, especially those fish that we know are high in omega-3s. Remove any visible fat that you see on meat or meat products, and watch cooking methods. Choose cooking methods such as broiling, baking, grilling, while decreasing the amount of frying or fried foods. Choose fat-free or low-fat milk as well as milk products that will substantially decrease overall saturated fat intake, and incorporate more plant-based foods, vegetables, fruits, as well as whole grains. Decrease the fat sources that are used in cooking, those which are in condiments or used as seasonings. Check food labels for total amount of fat. More importantly, however, saturated fat as well as the potential presence of trans fat. Reducing the amount of saturated fat in our diet can really have a substantial effect on reducing our risk of heart disease. But is it difficult? Take a look at this slide and you can see how just making a few subtle changes can significantly decrease saturated fat intake while raising unsaturated fat. If you compare the 2 meals depicted here, they are identical in the total amount of calories that they are providing. But look at the difference in amounts of saturated fat. The meal on the left has a substantially much higher amount of saturated fat compared to the meal on the right. By just swapping out a few items, you could see how the decrease can occur. Swapping out olive oil in place of butter, substituting avocado in place of bacon, substituting sunflower seeds for blue cheese in the salad, as well as substituting salmon for steak. All of those changes can definitely have an effect on reducing one's saturated fat intake. One of the healthier diet patterns that have been shown to lower disease risk is the Mediterranean diet. It originated in countries that border the Mediterranean Sea and incorporates the following features. Tends to be low in saturated fat, very low in trans fat, or even non-existent in trans fat. It focuses on monounsaturated as well as polyunsaturated fats. The type of fat sources come predominantly from olives, olive oil, nuts, as well as fish. Except for fish, consumption of other animal proteins tend to be low. However, the animals that are raised in this Mediterranean region, they're more apt to pasture graze. And that's a positive because these animals then become higher in omega-3s than in those animals that are grain-fed. So the consumption of meat, milk products, eggs, and so forth are going to have a much larger concentration of those desirable omega-3s. Another feature of this dietary pattern is that it's very rich in complex carbs and fiber. It incorporates various whole grains, vegetables, fruits, as well as legumes. Overall, it's been found to be high in nutrient value as well as phytochemicals. Another feature of the Mediterranean diet is that herbs and spices are used much more commonly than the addition of sodium. What are the benefits? Well, what's been identified is that there's a lower incidence of heart disease, some cancers, lower risk of diabetes, as well as chronic inflammatory disease. Obesity rates tend to be much, much lower. Because of these positive effects, the Mediterranean diet is definitely a food pattern that we as Americans should consider.